Jake Thompson, a seasoned police officer, cruised through the city park in his patrol car. His eyes narrowed as he spotted a group of young men lounging on benches. Their baggy clothes and backward caps immediately set off alarms in his mind. Jake pulled over and stepped out of his vehicle, his hand resting casually on his holster. "All right, boys," Jake called out, his voice gruff and authoritative. "Let's see some ID." The young men exchanged glances, their bodies tensing. One of them, a tall African-American teenager, spoke up. "We're just hanging out, officer. We haven't done anything wrong." Jake scoffed, his lip curling slightly. "Yeah, I've heard that one before. You all look like trouble to me. Now, ID's out, or we're going to have a problem." His tone left no room for argument, and the young men reluctantly complied. As Jake checked their identification, he made several snide comments about their appearance and demeanor. "You know, if you dressed like respectable citizens, maybe you wouldn't attract so much attention," he remarked, handing back the IDs with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Unbeknownst to Jake, Angela Carter, a local elementary school teacher, was walking her dog nearby. She watched the scene unfold with growing dismay. Unable to stand by silently, she approached the group. "Excuse me, officer," Angela said, her voice firm but polite. "Is there a problem here?" Jake turned, visibly irritated by the interruption. "Ma'am, this is police business. Please step back." Angela stood her ground. "These young men are my students' older brothers. They're good kids. I don't see why they're being harassed for simply existing in a public space." Jake's face reddened, his temper flaring. "I said step back. I'm doing my job, keeping this neighborhood safe from troublemakers." The tension between Jake and Angela was palpable. The young men watched nervously as the two adults faced off. Angela's eyes flashed with indignation, while Jake's posture became increasingly defensive. As the day wound down, Jake found himself at O'Malley's, a local bar frequented by off-duty cops. He recounted the park incident to his colleagues, embellishing details and painting himself as the hero keeping the streets safe. His fellow officers laughed and nodded, reinforcing Jake's prejudiced worldview. "You should have seen their faces when I showed up," Jake boasted, taking a swig of beer. "Bet they'll think twice before loitering in our park again." His colleagues chimed in with their own stories, each one more inflammatory than the last. As the night wore on, Jake's role as the antagonist in this unfolding drama became increasingly clear. Angela Carter stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her blazer and taking deep breaths. Today was the day she'd be introduced as the new supervisor for the police department's diversity project. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was determined to make a difference. As she entered the police station, Angela felt the weight of every gaze upon her. She straightened her shoulders and walked confidently into the conference room. The room was filled with officers, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Captain Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Officers, I'd like to introduce Angela Carter. She'll be leading our new community outreach and diversity initiative." A murmur rippled through the room. Angela stepped forward, her voice steady as she began to outline her plans. Halfway through her presentation, Jake Thompson's voice cut through the air. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed. "We're wasting time and resources on feel-good nonsense instead of actual policing." The room fell silent, all eyes darting between Jake and Angela. Angela paused, her gaze locking with Jake's. "Officer Thompson, I understand your concerns, but building trust with our community isn't nonsense. It's essential to effective policing." Jake stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We build trust by keeping the streets safe, not by holding hands and singing Kumbaya." Several officers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. Angela took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Safety and community relations aren't mutually exclusive, Officer Thompson. In fact, they're intrinsically linked. When people trust the police, they're more likely to report crimes and cooperate with investigations." She moved closer to Jake, her voice calm but firm. "Empathy and inclusion aren't weaknesses. They're tools that can make us better at our jobs. I'm not here to undermine your work, but to enhance it." Jake's jaw clenched, but something in Angela's words seemed to give him pause. The room watched in tense silence as the two faced off. Finally, Jake sat down, still scowling but no longer actively challenging Angela. As the meeting concluded, Angela could feel the mix of emotions in the room. Some officers approached her with tentative interest, while others huddled in corners, whispering their doubts. She knew she had a long road ahead, but this confrontation had been necessary. It had laid bare the resistance she'd face and the minds she'd need to change. Walking out of the station, Angela felt a glimmer of hope. She had stood her ground and planted a seed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As she drove home, she began to formulate strategies for her next move, knowing that changing hearts and minds would require patience, persistence, and unwavering determination. Jake Thompson sat in his patrol car, parked on a quiet street corner. His mind drifted back to a summer day from his childhood, some 30 years ago. He was 10 years old, sitting on the front porch of his grandfather's house. His grandfather, Robert Thompson, was a decorated police officer. Jake remembered the pride he felt watching his grandfather in his crisp uniform, badge gleaming in the sunlight. That day, several of Robert's colleagues had stopped by for a barbecue. "You've got a good kid there, Bob," one officer said, ruffling Jake's hair. "Maybe he'll follow in your footsteps one day." Jake beamed at the compliment, but his smile faded as the conversation took a darker turn. The officers began discussing a recent arrest, their voices lowered but still audible to the young Jake. "Another one of those thugs off the streets," an officer muttered. "You know how they are. Can't trust him." Jake's grandfather nodded in agreement. "It's a shame, but that's just how it is with their kind. We've got to stay vigilant." The young Jake absorbed these words, not fully understanding their implications, but sensing their weight. He looked up to these men, heroes in his eyes, and their words became truth to him. Back in the present, Jake rubbed his temples, the memory leaving him unsettled. For the first time, he found himself questioning the beliefs he'd held for so long. Angela's words from their confrontation echoed in his mind, challenging the foundation of his worldview. As he drove through the city streets, Jake observed the diverse faces of the community he'd sworn to protect. A nagging doubt crept into his thoughts. Had he been viewing these people through a distorted lens all this time? Meanwhile, across town, Angela sat at her dining room table, surrounded by her family. The atmosphere was tense as she recounted her confrontation with Jake at the police station. "Are you sure about this, Angie?" her brother asked, concern etched on his face. "Getting involved with the police department, especially with officers like that Thompson guy, it could be dangerous." Angela's mother nodded in agreement. "We're proud of you, sweetie, but we worry. These prejudices run deep. You could be putting yourself at risk." Angela listened to their concerns, understanding their fears. "I know it's not going to be easy," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "But if we don't try to bridge this gap, who will? Someone has to take the first step." Her family exchanged worried glances, but they could see the determination in Angela's eyes. They knew once she set her mind to something, there was no stopping her. As the night wore on, both Jake and Angela found themselves at crossroads, their convictions shaken, facing the prospect of a challenging journey ahead. The seeds of change had been planted, but the path to understanding would be long and fraught with obstacles. The community center bustled with activity as Angela Carter put the finishing touches on the decorations. She had organized this event to bring together local residents and law enforcement, hoping to foster understanding and dialogue. As she hung the last banner, she spotted Jake Thompson entering the hall, his face a mask of reluctance. "Officer Thompson," Angela greeted, her tone professional but cautious. "I'm glad you could make it." Jake nodded stiffly, his eyes scanning the room. "Just doing my job, Miss Carter." The event began, and a mix of community members and police officers filled the space. The atmosphere was tense, with both sides eyeing each other warily. Angela moved between groups, encouraging interaction and facilitating conversations. As the evening progressed, a commotion erupted outside. Angela rushed to the window to see a group of young men spray painting graffiti on the community center wall. Before she could react, Jake was already out the door. "Hey, stop right there." Jake's voice boomed as he approached the group. The young men scattered, but Jake managed to grab one by the arm. "You think this is funny, kid? Vandalizing public property?" The young man struggled against Jake's grip. "Let go of me, pig." You don't own these streets. Jake's face hardened, his grip tightening. That's it. You're coming with me. Angela burst out of the building, her heart racing. Officer Thompson, wait. She approached the scene, her hands raised in a calming gesture. Let's all take a breath here. No one needs to get hurt. Jake looked at her incredulously. Miss Carter, these punks were vandalizing the building. They need to be taught a lesson. Angela turned to the young man, who had stopped struggling but glared defiantly at Jake. What's your name? She asked gently. Marcus, he muttered. Marcus, can you tell me why you were spray painting the wall? The young man hesitated, then spoke. This center's supposed to be for the community, right? But it doesn't feel like our community. It feels like another way for them to control us. Angela nodded, understanding in her eyes. I hear you, Marcus. But destruction isn't the answer. Why don't you come inside and share your ideas on how we can make this center truly represent our community? Jake watched in disbelief as Marcus's defiance slowly melted. The young man nodded, and Angela gently led him inside, leaving Jake to process what he had just witnessed. As they walked back into the center, Angela caught Jake's eye. In that moment, a flicker of understanding passed between them. Jake had seen a different approach to conflict resolution, one that prioritized communication over force. It was a small step, but a significant one in their journey toward mutual understanding. The community center event had wound down, leaving Jake and Angela alone in the parking lot. Jake approached Angela, his posture less rigid than before. Ms. Carter, can we talk? Jake's voice was gruff, but carried a hint of uncertainty. Angela nodded, surprised by his initiative. Of course, Officer Thompson. They found a bench nearby and sat down, an awkward silence settling between them. Jake cleared his throat. That thing with the kid earlier. I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that before, Jake admitted. Angela smiled softly. Sometimes, people just need to be heard. Jake nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. I've been thinking about what you said in the meeting, about empathy and inclusion. It's not easy for me. Angela turned to face him fully. Change never is, Officer Thompson, but recognizing the need for it is a crucial first step. Jake's brow furrowed. I've been a cop for 15 years. I've seen things. It's hard not to become cynical. I understand, Angela said, but cynicism can blind us to the good in people. A moment passed before Angela spoke again. When I was 8, my family moved to a predominantly white neighborhood. On my first day of school, a group of kids surrounded me in the playground. They called me names, told me I didn't belong there. Jake shifted uncomfortably, but Angela continued. A teacher saw what was happening and intervened. But instead of punishing the kids, she organized a cultural exchange day. She had me share stories about my family's traditions and encouraged other students to do the same. It changed everything. Those same kids who had taunted me became my friends. Jake absorbed her words, his expression thoughtful. That teacher, she sounds a lot like you. Angela smiled. She's the reason I became a teacher. She showed me the power of understanding and education in combating prejudice. Jake was quiet for a moment. I've never really thought about it that way, he admitted. In my job, we're taught to be tough, to see threats everywhere. It's hard to let that go. No one's asking you to let your guard down completely, Angela assured him. But maybe there's room for a different approach sometimes. As they sat there, the tension between them began to ease. Jake found himself opening up about his own insecurities, his fear of change, and the pressure he felt to maintain the status quo. Angela listened without judgment, recognizing the vulnerability in Jake's admissions. As their conversation drew to a close, both felt a shift in their dynamic. They weren't friends, not yet, but a foundation of mutual respect had been laid. As they parted ways, Jake paused. Ms. Carter, thank you for the talk. Angela nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Anytime, Officer Thompson, anytime. The city was in turmoil. News of a police shooting of an unarmed teenager had spread like wildfire, igniting long-simmering tensions. Protesters flooded the streets, their angry chants echoing off building walls. The police department was on high alert, and both Jake and Angela were called in to help manage the situation. They arrived at the scene separately, but quickly found themselves standing side by side, facing a sea of angry faces. The air was thick with tension, and the line between protesters and police seemed ready to snap at any moment. Jake instinctively reached for his baton, his jaw clenched. "This is going to get ugly," he muttered. Angela placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. "Wait," she said. "Let's try something different." Before Jake could respond, Angela stepped forward, crossing the invisible line that separated the police from the protesters. Jake's heart raced as he watched her approach the crowd, certain she was walking into danger. "My name is Angela Carter," she called out, her voice steady and clear. "I work with the police department on community relations. I'm here to listen to your concerns." The crowd's chanting faltered, confusion replacing anger on many faces. A young woman stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "Listen? Where was the listening when that cop shot Jamal? Where's the justice?" Angela nodded, acknowledging the pain in the woman's voice. "You're right to be angry. What happened to Jamal was a tragedy, and it shouldn't have happened. We're here because we want to prevent such tragedies in the future." Jake watched in amazement as Angela continued to engage with the protesters. She didn't make excuses or deflect blame. Instead, she listened, acknowledged their pain, and promised to work towards change. After a moment's hesitation, Jake stepped forward to join her. "I'm Officer Thompson," he said, his voice rougher than Angela's but equally sincere. "I can't change what happened to Jamal, but I'm here to listen and learn how we can do better." The crowd's hostility didn't disappear entirely, but the atmosphere shifted. Some protesters began to voice their concerns more calmly, while others shared personal stories of their experiences with law enforcement. As Jake and Angela listened, they realized the depth of the community's pain and distrust. It was a sobering experience, but also a hopeful one. For the first time, real dialogue was happening. Hours passed, and while the protest didn't disperse entirely, the mood had changed dramatically. As night fell, Jake and Angela found themselves sitting on the steps of the police station, exhausted but oddly energized. "That was intense," Jake said, running a hand through his hair. Angela nodded. "But important. We made a start today." Jake looked at her, a new respect in his eyes. "Yeah, we did. Thanks for showing me a different way." As they sat there, both knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time, it felt like real change might be possible. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, tugging at his collar. The elementary school auditorium was packed with parents, teachers, and students for the annual Community Engagement Day. Angela had invited him as a guest speaker, insisting his presence would be valuable. Now, surrounded by wary glances and hushed whispers, Jake was beginning to regret his decision. As Angela introduced him, Jake could feel the tension in the room. He approached the podium, clearing his throat nervously. "Good evening," he began, his voice gruffer than he intended. "I'm Officer Jake Thompson." A hand shot up immediately. Jake nodded at the parent, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression. "Officer Thompson, why should we trust the police when we constantly see reports of brutality and racial profiling?" Jake felt his defenses rise, but remembered Angela's advice. He took a deep breath before responding. "That's a fair question," he said, surprising himself with his candor. "The truth is, we haven't always gotten it right." "I haven't always gotten it right?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jake continued, his voice growing steadier. "I became a cop because I wanted to protect people, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of who people included. I started seeing threats instead of community members." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Some were skeptical, others curious. "I'm here because I'm trying to do better. To be better. I can't change the past, but I can work towards a better future. And I need your help to do that." As Jake spoke, he found himself sharing personal experiences. Times when he'd acted on prejudice, moments that now filled him with shame. But he also talked about his recent efforts to change, the lessons he'd learned from working with Angela and engaging with the community. To his surprise, the audience began to engage. Questions came not just from adults, but from children too. They were tough questions, but Jake answered them as honestly as he could. One student, a young black boy, raised his hand. "Mr. Officer, Have you ever been scared on your job? Jake nodded, a small smile on his face. More times than I can count, kid. Fear is part of the job, but I'm learning that how we handle that fear is what matters. As the session wound down, Jake felt drained but oddly lighter. He'd exposed his flaws and shortcomings, yet instead of scorn, he was met with cautious appreciation for his honesty. Angela approached him as the crowd dispersed, her eyes shining with pride. That was incredible, Jake. You really connected with them. Jake rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed but pleased. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. Thanks for pushing me to do this, Angela. As they left the school, Jake realized that for the first time in years, he felt hopeful about the future of police-community relations. It was a small step, but an important one, and he was committed to keeping the momentum going. Over the next few months, Jake and Angela found themselves spending more time together outside of work. What had started as a professional relationship was slowly evolving into a genuine friendship. One evening, they met at a local coffee shop. Jake arrived first, securing a quiet corner table. When Angela walked in, he was surprised to find himself smiling. "Hey," Jake greeted, pushing a cup towards her. "I got your usual." Angela's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You remembered my coffee order?" Jake shrugged, a bit embarrassed. "Yeah, well, don't let it go to your head." As they settled into conversation, Jake found himself opening up about his personal life, his divorce, his strained relationship with his teenage daughter. Angela listened attentively, offering support without judgment. "You know," Jake said, stirring his coffee absently, "I never thought I'd be friends with someone like you." Angela tilted her head. "Someone like me?" Jake fumbled for words. "You know, a community organizer type. I always saw people like you as the enemy." Instead of taking offense, Angela chuckled. "And I never thought I'd be friends with a cop who once embodied everything I was fighting against." Their laughter filled the coffee shop, drawing curious glances from other patrons. As their meeting drew to a close, Jake's expression turned serious. "Angela, I owe you an apology. The things I said when we first met, the way I treated you and others in the community, it was wrong. I'm sorry." Angela reached across the table, squeezing his hand briefly. "Thank you, Jake. That means a lot, and I'm proud of how far you've come." Jake nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "I've been thinking, maybe we could start a mentorship program? Pair officers with kids from the community. Build understanding from the ground up." Angela's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea. We could call it badges and backpacks or something like that." As they brainstormed ideas for the program, both felt a sense of excitement. They were no longer just talking about change. They were actively working to create it. Before they parted ways, Jake hesitated, then asked, "Hey, there's a jazz concert in the park this weekend. Want to check it out?" "As friends, of course," he added quickly. Angela smiled warmly. "I'd like that, Jake. As friends." As they left the coffee shop, both Jake and Angela felt a sense of optimism. Their unlikely friendship was proof that change was possible, that bridges could be built across even the widest divides. And with their new mentorship program on the horizon, they were ready to spread that change throughout their community. The Badges and Backpacks program was gaining traction, with positive feedback from both the police department and the community. Jake felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in years. However, his newfound optimism was about to be tested. One morning, Jake was called into Captain Rodriguez's office. The captain's face was grave as Jake took a seat. "Thompson, there's an internal affairs investigation being opened. It's about you." Jake's stomach dropped. "What? Why?" Rodriguez sighed heavily. "Someone's dug up some of your old records. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling. It doesn't look good, Jake." Jake's mind raced. He knew his past wasn't clean, but he'd been working hard to change. "Cap, that's not who I am anymore. You know that." "I know, Jake. But IA doesn't care about who you are now. They care about who you were then." As Jake left the office, his world spinning, he bumped into Angela in the hallway. One look at his face told her something was wrong. "Jake? What happened?" He pulled her aside, explaining the situation in hushed tones. Angela's face grew serious as she listened. "This is serious, Jake. If these allegations stick, It could derail everything we've been working for. Jake nodded, his voice tight. I know. I don't know what to do. Angela squeezed his arm reassuringly. We'll figure this out. I'm not giving up on you, or on our program. Over the next few days, as word of the investigation spread, Jake felt the weight of suspicious glances from his colleagues. Some of the community members he'd been working with started to distance themselves. The progress he'd made felt like it was crumbling around him, but Angela stood firm. She called an emergency meeting with the community leaders involved in their program. I know you've all heard the rumors, she began, her voice steady. But I'm here to tell you that Jake Thompson is not the same man he was years ago. He's changed, and he's committed to making things right. One of the leaders, Mr. Johnson, spoke up. How can we trust him now, knowing what he's done in the past? Angela met his gaze unflinchingly. Because I've seen his change firsthand. And because if we believe in second chances, in the power of people to grow and learn, then we need to stand by those beliefs even when it's difficult. Her impassioned defense swayed many, but not all. As the meeting adjourned, the future of their program hung in the balance. Later that evening, Angela found Jake sitting alone in the park, lost in thought. Hey, she said softly, sitting beside him. How are you holding up? Jake's voice was hoarse when he replied. Why are you still standing by me, Angela? After everything you've learned? Angela's response was immediate and firm. Because I believe in the man you are now, Jake. And because the work we're doing is too important to give up on. As they sat there, watching the sun set, both knew that the real test of their friendship and their mission was just beginning. As the internal affairs investigation continued, Jake found himself increasingly isolated at the precinct. Most of his colleagues kept their distance, unsure of how to react to the allegations. However, one officer, Mike Dawson, seemed intent on making things worse. One afternoon, Jake overheard Mike talking to a group of officers in the locker room. Can you believe Thompson's still showing his face around here? Mike sneered. Guy's a disgrace to the badge. Jake's fists clenched, but he forced himself to walk away. Later that day, Mike cornered him in the parking lot. Hey, Thompson, Mike called out. I've got a proposition for you. I know some guys who can make this IA investigation go away. For a price, of course. Jake stared at him in disbelief. Are you suggesting we interfere with an official investigation? Mike shrugged. Come on, we both know the system's rigged. Sometimes you gotta play dirty to survive. For a moment, Jake was tempted. It would be so easy to make this all disappear. But then he thought of Angela, of the trust she'd placed in him, of the work they were doing. No, Jake said firmly. I'm not that person anymore, Mike. And I won't be part of your corruption. Mike's face darkened. You're making a big mistake, Thompson. Don't come crying to me when they strip you of your badge. As Mike stormed off, Jake pulled out his phone and dialed Captain Rodriguez's number. Cap, I need to report an attempted obstruction of justice. The next day, Jake found himself in the captain's office again, this time with Angela by his side. He recounted his interaction with Mike, his voice steady despite his nerves. Captain Rodriguez listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Jake finished, the captain leaned back in his chair. Thompson, I've known you for a long time. I've seen you at your worst, and now, I think I'm seeing you at your best. Your honesty in reporting this incident speaks volumes. Jake nodded, relieved but still tense. What happens now, sir? We'll investigate Dawson's actions. As for your case, in light of this new information and your recent community work, I'm recommending that the IA investigation be closed. Jake's eyes widened in surprise. Angela squeezed his hand, her face beaming with pride. As they left the office, Angela turned to Jake. You did it, Jake. You stood up for what's right, even when it was hard. Jake smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. I couldn't have done it without you, Angela. You believed in me when no one else did. News of Jake's actions spread quickly through the precinct and the community. Many who had doubted him began to see him in a new light. The Badges and Backpacks program flourished, with more officers and community members eager to participate. As Jake and Angela stood before a new group of mentors and mints, Jake felt a sense of purpose he'd never experienced before. He looked at Angela, gratitude filling his heart. Ready to change some lives? Angela asked, her eyes twinkling. Jake nodded, a genuine smile on his face. More than ready. Let's do this. Together, they stepped forward, ready to continue their work of building bridges and transforming their community, one relationship at a time.